Well, what does justice look like for future generations as the ongoing climate crisis continues to divide? Ticker Climate starts right now. Hello and welcome to Ticker Climate. My name's Holly Stearns. It's great to have you tuning in every single week for this important and ongoing discussion. Now on Ticker Climate, we tackle the climate crisis that is facing our planet and we examine what actions governments and corporations need to be taking. Now my co-host Scott Hamilton is a climate change and energy expert and he joins me now for more. Scott, what are we talking about on today's episode?
Yes, hello, Holly. Great to see you again. And there's one thing that gets the attention of board members right around the world in terms of company boards. It's when there's major court decisions. So today we're focusing on some very big decisions around the world in climate law, what it means for these power shifts that are going on, and what the strategy that companies need to be thinking about as well as everyone else. It's going to be a great episode.
Indeed, and joining us for today is Professor Jacqueline Peel, who is a leading and internationally recognised in her field of environmental and climate change law. She's the co-author of several books and numerous articles on these topics. She's here today to help us sift through the world of climate change law. Jackie, welcome to you. It's great to have your company. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Let's get right into it.
Thank you very much.
Let's get right into it. We know today there was some breaking news coming out that regulations for Australia's renewable energy funder to invest in fossil fuel technologies may in fact be illegal. I just wanted to get your thoughts. Is this actually open to be challenged in court at all?
Look, I haven't been following the news quite as closely as you obviously today, Holly, because I'm just returning from leave. But look, these are open questions at the moment because a lot more cases are being brought in Australia around developments as they're occurring. So I haven't looked at this particular instance, but there's lots of different avenues that are being explored by groups to see to what extent they can challenge decisions and regulations that they think are not consistent with a safe climate future.
And Jackie, we know obviously this is your area of expertise. You're very well known in this area. You're the director of Melbourne Climate Futures. Can you just delve into a little bit about your background and what that is all about there?
Yeah, so my background is in climate law, which itself is a new area. We really didn't have climate law 20 years ago, but I really started in environmental law and got interested in this question of how law and regulation could help us deal with the climate crisis. And one particular aspect that I've focused on a lot is how we use the courts to drive change. And in Australia, that's been a really interesting area to look at because we've had the second most number of court cases globally on climate issues. The US, prodigious litigators, beat us out, but we've had huge numbers of cases come before courts trying to get action from governments to do more on climate change at every level. So that's a particular focused on, and now I'm taking on a new role which is expanding beyond that to look at multidisciplinary climate research through Melbourne Climate Futures. So how we can harness all the great research and researchers that the University of Melbourne has in the climate area to make a difference on climate and harness that research for greater impact and influence.
Certainly is a terrific new initiative at Melbourne University, Jackie. Speaking of cases, there was a landmark case in the last week in New South Wales, which was requiring the EPA up there to take action on climate change. And interestingly, the Minister, Matt Keane, said that he wasn't going to appeal it. Can you just explain to the audience what this is all about and the significance of these sort of cases, please?
Yeah, so this is a really important recent case coming out of New South Wales and the New South Wales Land and Environment Court. The name of the group that brought the case is the Bushfire Survivors, and they're really looking for the New South Wales government to be taking more action to protect the New South Wales community from the impacts of climate change. And they're saying, look, you've got the existing tools under your environmental legislation to be able to do this. All the EPA really needs is to take action to develop policies and guidelines under that legislation. And the court agreed, saying that in fact the Environmental Protection Agency in New South Wales did have a duty to develop and put in place those laws, policies and guidelines, its legislative mandate. And that the fact that the New South Wales government is not appealing that decision means that it now stands and forms part of the law. So the EPA is going to be progressing, implementing that decision and putting in place more policy and guidance about how the state of New South Wales is responding to climate change. And we've seen also this week, amongst many momentous news coming out of New South Wales, that the New South Wales government is also endorsing a very progressive emissions reduction target of seeking to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. So clearly they've got the target in place, and this case will help the EPA to put in place the policies that will give effect to that kind of target.
Jackie, we know there have also been a series of other recent court decisions on climate change, including the federal minister that has a duty of care to protect younger generations from the climate crisis. We know that that made headlines right across the nation. Could you just tell us a little bit about this decision and what the latest details are on this?
Yeah, so 2021 in general has been a big year for the courts and climate change. And this case brought by a group of young people, one of the lead plaintiffs was Vijay Sharma, which is the name of the case. We're bringing this litigation against the Federal Environment Minister about her decision to approve extension of a coal mine in New South Wales. And the argument that was being put by the young people there was that really the minister had a duty to consider their interests and safeguard the rights and interests of young people who are going to bear the major impacts of climate change in the future through things like more frequent bushfires, through the health impacts of heat waves and the like. And the court there, at least in the first instance, so went in the initial case before the federal court when it was argued, decided that in fact this duty of care did exist on the part of the government, so that when the minister was deciding yes or no on this mining proposal, she did have to think about and take into account in a legal way the interests of the kids, and not just the kids in the case but all Australian children in making that decision. So it was really significant in sort of setting a new benchmark for governments to care about climate change and particularly how it impacts our young people. The latest in the case, Holly, is that the federal minister, the federal government is appealing the decision. So that means it'll go to the next stage and to the Federal Court of Appeal for decision, and there's a potential that it might go all the way up to the High Court. So it's not a finished decision just yet, but the first stage was a win for the plaintiffs in that case.
Yeah, I just find it gobsmacking that the federal minister would think that he doesn't have a duty of care to future generations and making this appeal. Jackie, I understand that you've been leading the development of a strategy for these sorts of groups to get into the courts. What is your secret of success, and how are we being so successful at the moment, which is quite unusual?
Yeah, look, what we've done in our research is really to focus on what makes for a sort of recipe for success for strategic climate litigation. And strategic climate litigation is where litigation is being brought to advance a broader social or policy process, and in this case to take action on climate change. And what we've seen with groups that are successful in these kinds of actions is that they're often not just litigating, they're not just taking a court case, but they're also combining it with a broader campaign. So they're trying to bring the public, business, government along with them in terms of the story that they're telling, and the litigation is just one piece of that. The other thing that we've really seen is that the way that these cases have impact is not just limited to the judgment itself that might be delivered. So success is not just winning in court. success is often how that decision can be used to help change the behaviour of different actors, whether that's governments, whether it's something that motivates civil society and youth groups, for example, or changes business culture. And we've seen in particular that businesses can be quite sensitive to the threat of litigation, and where you have that kind of risk emerging, that they might adopt activities or behaviours that try to prevent the litigation risk materialising. So there have been some of the lessons that litigation usually needs to go hand in hand with a campaign, and that the impacts from the litigation are often not just the direct win in court.
Yeah, interesting. Remarkable cases that you've worked on. We are under 50 days until COP26, Jackie. What role are the courts going to have in the conference, and roles such as carbon border taxes, which might actually follow after COP26?
Yeah, look, so the courts themselves are not going to be playing a role in those negotiations, but certainly they've been issuing a set of decisions in the lead up to COP that will influence a lot of the negotiations. And some of those decisions have been, like the Sharma case, finding duties of government to take into account the rights of future generations. There's also an international case on the horizon where Vanuatu is seeking to get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on a similar kind of question. So these sorts of things will be in the background and in the minds of negotiators as they're looking at and negotiating about what the obligations of states are to ensure a safe climate future, to keep 1.5 degrees of warming in sight. So that's the courts themselves are not going to play a direct role, but these cases are feeding into the discussions around, well, if countries don't fulfil their responsibilities, then what might be the next steps in terms of litigation. On carbon border adjustments, this is a really complex area of law, but it relates to trade in goods and services. The general idea is for countries like Australia that don't have strong carbon pricing or carbon policies, that we could be subject to other countries imposing a sort of border adjustment or tax on our goods to level the playing field. And we might expect to see some of those carbon tax border adjustment schemes go before courts, particularly the World Trade Organization, which will be interesting to see whether they're able to be maintained under.
Certainly is amazing stuff, Jackie. I suppose, sort of final question from me, what would be your message to all the directors on company boards, both in Australia and overseas, when it comes to climate risk and climate law? What would you be saying to them?
Look, I think it's actually a community that's already well attuned to the risks of not adequately disclosing climate risks, and that there may be litigation that follows. So actually, I think it's an audience who's already ready for the message. And it's become pretty clear over the last 5 years that the pace of change and that's needed to transition to a clean energy economy is quickening, and that companies and businesses generally have a part to play in that. A lot of that is around disclosing what they're doing to their shareholders, but also managing those risks. And we've seen with announcements by companies like BHP recently, for example, that companies are already beginning to step up their action to address climate change, and they're facing more and more pressure from shareholders and investors to really come up to the challenge on those questions.
Absolutely.
Sure.
That is all we have time for today on Ticker Climate. It always goes quick every week. There's so much to get through. Jackie, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and speak about this. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Jackie.
And that is all we have time for today on Ticker Climate. Thank you for your company as well. And remember, you can head to tickeroriginals.co for all sorts of discussions from climate, travel and crypto and more. My name's Holly Stearns. Thank you so much for your time.